The Celtic Druids, by Godfrey Higgins. Chapter 1. The Origins of Druidic Language and Calculation. Upon scrutiny of the primordial histories concerning the western regions of Europe, one incessantly encounters the monumental vestiges of a people identified as Druids. In numerous locales, the ruins to which I allude possess immense proportions and were, perchance, in distant epochs adorned with profound magnificence. A multitude of treatises regarding these subjects and their purported progenitors have been composed by diverse authors, each of whom, in substantiation of his particular system, has proffered observations or amassed unique original materials. Notwithstanding, these writings have been widely dispersed, and a significant portion thereof remains arduous to procure. Contemplating this, I have concluded that the subject is far from exhausted, and that a comprehensive survey of the entirety might prove meritorious to the antiquarian community. I have deemed myself to possess certain advantages not held by my precursors, among which the utility of their own observations is not the least significant. I have endeavored to eschew what appear to me as their fallacies, particularly the propensity to indulge excessively in imagination, an error into which most scholars of such inquiries are prone to lapse. My objective has been to delineate a distinct boundary between facts resting upon plain and incontrovertible evidence and conclusions that are merely speculative. For without some allowance for the latter, no advancement could ever be realized, and all investigations of this genre would remain stagnant and unengaging. By such expedients, I have aspired to produce a tome that may satisfy those who transcend the common prejudices of education, who will not summarily dismiss as absurd all that is novel to them, but who will examine the evidence via the sound principles of reason and accepted modern criticism. Since the demonstrations of numerous significant circumstances regarding these people depend upon etymological research, I am compelled initially to proffer certain remarks concerning the genesis of language. Here at the commencement, the reader may surmise that I deviate from the precept I have just established for my conduct in this discourse. Yet I trust that by maintaining a well-defined demarcation between fact and theory, he shall find little grounds for grievance. To attain the bedrock of my subject, I have found it requisite to undertake a meticulous examination of the alphabets of several ancient tongues, from which it is probable that the names of places or persons associated with the ancient Druids may have been derived, and to subject them to comparative analysis. This investigation has induced me to speculate upon the very origin of written language. It is, indeed, nothing more than a speculation. Yet, as it is proffered solely as such, I cannot conceive it to be an instance of groundless fabrication that may not be pardonable. Furthermore, it is intimately correlated with reasoning upon certain facts that shall be found entirely original and, I believe, conclusive regarding the antiquity of the letters of the Celts and their Druids in these domains. It appears imperative to establish these facts at the inception, for by that means I shall be enabled, without impropriety, to assume greater latitude in my subsequent investigations. Initially, perhaps, the unlearned reader may feel somewhat alarmed at the exhibition of scholarship in the subsequent tables of foreign characters, arranged in lines and marshaled as if for battle. Yet, once the initial apprehension has dissipated, he will discover nothing arduous, nothing that he cannot easily comprehend with ordinary scholastic attainments. To comprehend the reasoning of this work, no proficiency in the languages contained within the alphabetic tables shall be requisite. A modicum of attention to the principle upon which I proceed will enable anyone to adjudge the plausibility of the conclusions drawn from the etymologies of the cited names of places and persons. In the initial table on page 4, the first column comprises the names of the Samaritan and Hebrew letters in the correct ancient sequence. The second column exhibits the Samaritan characters. The third displays the Hebrew or Chaldee characters utilized subsequent to the Babylonian captivity. The fourth demonstrates the numerical values of the Samaritan, the Chaldee, and the Greek letters. The fifth contains the Greek letters. In the sixth, asterisks designate the letters first transported to Greece from Phoenicia by Cadmus. The seventh comprises the nomenclature of the Greek letters. The eighth contains the Celtic Irish letters in English characters, positioned opposite to the corresponding letters of the other alphabets. The ninth elucidates the significations of the Celtic Irish names of their letters. In the second table appears the Irish Babeloth alphabet with its English equivalents and its names as transcribed from Valency, the letter P having likely been omitted through inadvertence. Numbers 4, 5, and 6 constitute the Irish Beth-Louisnian alphabet from the same authority. Number 7 represents an ancient Etruscan alphabet according to Swinton. Number 8 denotes another ancient Etruscan alphabet according to Gorius. Number 9 is a singular Etruscan alphabet selected from the various ancient alphabets by Mr. Astle. Number 10 is an Irish esoteric alphabet designated Agam Beth-Louisnian, according to Valency. This was originally inscribed vertically like a tree in the manner of modern Chinese script, but was subsequently written horizontally, and in its principal line it bears some resemblance to the Sanskrit. Number 11 is another form of Irish script termed virgular Agam. Number 12 is an exemplar of the characters discovered in the ruins of Persepolis. Number 13 represents an inscription discovered upon a sepulchre in Ireland known as the Callan inscription. I harbor no doubt that the Samaritan, the Hebrew, the Greek, and the English alphabets, as they appear in the first table, specifically the 17 primary letters marked with asterisks, constitute nearly accurate representations of one another, as they existed originally without any double letters. Undoubtedly, in the course of time, the pronunciation would alter as we ascertain it has done. But generally, for the purpose of etymology, we must revert to the fountainhead. This mutation may be exemplified by the vowel o, which transformed into I. As for example, in snore, sinar, it became singar, sewer, seeger, oz, gaze, amra, gamara, and finally, the Masoretes have corrupted it into the barbarous nasal gn. It is evident that nothing could have exceeded the negligence with which the Greeks, and subsequently the moderns, have rendered the words and letters of one language into another. They possessed no system. All was the result of accident. The letter O, the 16th in the alphabet, succeeding the nun or n, and preceding the pi or p, and representing the number 70 in both Greek and Hebrew, is frequently rendered as the letter e, the initial character, rather than o, the 16th. For instance, ostert, a start, again bowl, ball, occasionally by the letter I, as in obri, ibri. As we acknowledge that this extreme negligence and total absence of system occurred with the Greeks, Latins, and moderns, it may have similarly affected the Israelites, the Phoenicians, or the Carthaginians. And this is a plausible circumstance which ought always to be retained in remembrance within our etymologies. Whatever judgment may be passed upon my system, it shall possess at least this beneficial effect, that the unlearned reader will be enabled to understand perfectly every etymological deduction that I have drawn. Whenever a Hebrew word is utilized, It is immediately followed by the corresponding English characters, as delineated in the table. This provision ensures that the lay reader may at all times grasp the argument. Erudite scholars may perhaps observe that, within my etymological analyses, I omit consideration of the Masoretic points. It is perhaps incumbent upon me to declare that I regard them as a wholly modern invention, possessing no intrinsic value, save for their occasional utility in demonstrating the traditional readings accepted by the Jews during the Dark Ages. With perhaps a solitary exception, they have been abandoned by the scholarly community. Reference may be made to a treatise I published in number 65 of the Classical Journal. The reader will therein discern that this inquiry was most elaborately debated and resolved in favor of my doctrine by Capellus, Elias Levita, Thomas Urpenius, Casaubon, Scaliger, Vossius, Drusius, Arnold Boot, Rivet, Louis de Dieu, Grotius, Spanheim, Festus Homius, Beza, Selden, Bishop Walton, Sennert, Basnage, Berman, Simon, Limborch, Marinus, Vitringa, the clerk, Human, the lawyer, Hubigant, Bishop Loth, Kennicott, Bishop Marsh, and divers others. Consequently, I deem it superfluous to adduce any further evidence regarding this subject. Before advancing further with our thesis, we shall now, with the reader's indulgence, engage in a measure of speculative construction, that castle building in the air to which allusion was previously made, which, I flatter myself, will not ultimately prove entirely devoid of utility. In contemplating the primordial history of the human race, I have frequently entertained speculations regarding the methodology man likely adopted to acquire proficiency in the arts of reading, writing, and arithmetic, assuming he was not, at the miracle of his creation, endowed with an innate cognition of these sciences. Manifold conclusive arguments, which need not be enumerated here, might be advanced against this latter supposition. This being the case, it follows as a matter of necessity that we must attribute the acquisition of these sciences to the fruit of his own ingenuity and the gradual evolution of his faculties. It thus becomes a matter of profound interest and curiosity to ascertain the probable line of conduct and the progressive gradations he would have pursued. If we postulate that man received no further enlightenment at his creation than that which was absolutely requisite for his subsistence, we must concede that he would remain entirely ignorant of numerals and letters. It has occurred to me that the following process might have ensued once he had attained the art of speech with a tolerable degree of facility and fluency. He would principally commence by enumerating the objects surrounding him that chanced to interest him most, perhaps his progeny. His fingers would serve as his primary counters. Through their agency, he would be led to decimal calculation, rather than the more advantageous octenary calculation he might otherwise have adopted, that is, arresting the count at 8 instead of 10. Proceeding thus as 8 plus 1, 8 plus 2, 8 plus 3, in lieu of 10 plus 1 or 11, 10 plus 2 or 12, 10 plus 3 or 13. There exists nothing inherent in decimal arithmetic. It is entirely artificial, and I entertain no doubt that it originated from the number of the fingers. I hypothesize that man was created at or near latitude 45, where the country would be properly designated, as it is in Genesis, a paradise or garden of delight. He would dwell in ease with little or no labor, as the fruits of that clime would afford him sustenance throughout the annual cycle. This state would endure for several generations. During this golden age, he would contemplate the objects surrounding him. I am of the opinion that he would commence counting his fingers, and thereby acquire arithmetic, extending at least as far as the enumeration of 10 or 20. He would select 10 small stones, which we shall term calculi, and by arranging them into parcels, subsequently dividing them, etc., he would acquire the concept of the 10 numerals. He would form them into 2 heaps and perceive their equality. Subsequently, he would arrange them into 5 heaps and institute a comparison. Thus would he commence the operation we shall designate as calculation. When he had perceived that the 5 heaps of calculi were all equal to one another, he would truly have acquired the concept of that which we term calculation. During the interval in which this transpired, he would observe the sun and the moon. The latter he would observe to wax and wane, and after many lunations, he would commence to surmise that its motion was what we term periodical. And although he possessed not the nomenclature of a period, he would soon entertain the concept in a tentative manner, and with his calculi he would initiate a calculation. He would deposit 1 calculus each day for 28 days, the duration of 1 moon's existence. Through a few months of observation, he would acquire a perfect conception of a period of 28 days, and thus be induced to expand his arithmetic to 28 calculi. He would now attempt all manner of experiments with these calculi. He would first divide them into 2 portions of equal number. He would then divide them again, each into 2 parts, perceiving that the 2 were equal, that the 4 were equal, and that the 4 heaps constituted the aggregate 28. He would now certainly discover the art of addition and the art of division, in a rudimentary fashion by means of these calculi, likely without initially assigning appellations to these operations. He would also attempt to divide one of the 4 parcels of calculi, into which the moon's age was partitioned, yet further. But here, for the first time, he would encounter a difficulty. He could have them, or divide them into equal parcels, no lower than 7. And herein originated the first cycle of 7 days, or the week. This is not an arbitrary division, but one perfectly natural, an effect which must transpire, or succeed the process I have here delineated, and which appears to have occurred in every nation that has acquired the art of arithmetic. From the utmost bounds of the East to the Ultima Thule, the septenary cycle may be discovered. By this juncture, perhaps hundreds of years subsequent to his creation, man would have acquired a modicum of geometry. From the shell of the egg or the nut, he would have ascertained how to describe an awkward, ill-formed circle, or to trace a line in the sand with his finger which would converge at both extremities. The spider would certainly have instructed him in the formation of angles, though he likely comprehended nothing of their properties. As generations elapsed, man would attempt manifold experiments upon his circle. He would divide it into 2, subsequently into 4, and thus he would construct radii. Whilst he was engaged in this, he would commence to observe that the sun resembled the moon in the circumstance that it was periodical, that it changed continually and continually reverted to its former state, producing summer and winter, spring and autumn, that, after it had blessed him during a certain interval with warmth, comfort, and a plenteousness of fruits, it gradually withdrew, yet in a certain number of days it returned, as the moon had returned, to its antecedent condition. He would proceed as he had done with respect to the moon, collect calculi and deposit 1 for every day, and he would ascertain that there were 360 days in a period of the solar revolution. About this time, in all probability, he would chance upon the comparison of his period constantly returning into itself with his circle, the sun's endless period with his endless circle. He would deposit his calculi about the circumference of his circle. By utilizing these calculi, he would bisect the circumference into 2 distinct portions. Subsequently, he would have these sections transversely, thereby generating 4 quadrants of circles, each comprising 90 stones. He would bisect the 90s, yet finding himself unable to proceed further with having beyond reducing the 90 into 2 parts, he would, after numerous trials, resolve to partition his 90 into 3 sections. Arranged upon the circumference, resulting in groups of 30, he would once more trisect each 30, ascertaining that each minor division contained 10 calculi, the paramount figure in his arithmetic, while the aggregate sum would correspond to the duration of a solar revolution, 360 days. By this juncture, he must have attained considerable proficiency in arithmetic and geometry. He must have mastered the 4 fundamental rules of arithmetic, as well as the construction of a square, a right-angled triangle, and a perfect circle, alongside potentially other advantageous knowledge within those sciences. To this entire premise, no valid objection can be raised, save perhaps regarding the assumption that he reckoned the solar period at 360 days. Yet, we are fully justified in this postulate by the well-established historical fact that the ancients, even within the scope of recorded annals, genuinely believed the year to consist of merely 360 days. Founded upon the circumstances previously delineated, I posit that this rationale occasioned the partition of the circle into 360 distinct parts or degrees. Subsequently, philosophers began to apply their utmost intellectual ingenuity to the geometry of the circle. Initially, they bisected it into 2 segments of 180 degrees each. Thereafter, they divided it into 4 quadrants of 90 degrees, subsequently trisecting each 90-degree section. They observed the existence of 12 such divisions in total, which were later designated as signs and assumed a role of profound significance. Following this, they trisected each of the 12 signs into parts termed decans, and these decans were further bisected into segments known as dodecans. Consequently, the circle comprised 360 degrees, 2 semicircles of 180 degrees, 4 quadrants of 90 degrees, 12 signs of 30 degrees, 36 decans of 10 degrees, or 24 parts of 15 degrees, wherein each 15-degree segment was trisected into portions of 5 degrees or dodecans, with each dodecan measuring 5 degrees. In a manner analogous to this geometric progression, they likely proceeded with the temporal division of the year. Since the year comprised the same number of days as the circle possessed degrees, they partitioned it into 12 months, each containing 30 days. Furthermore, as each day corresponded to 1 degree of the circle, or to each calculus placed upon its circumference, and given that each degree was divided into 60 minutes, and each minute into 60 seconds, they divided the day in an identical fashion. Bailey asserts that this constituted its original division, of which our current 60 minutes and 60 seconds remain a vestige. Approximately concurrent with these developments, they would have ascertained that the moon completed 13 lunations within a year, each spanning 28 days, rather than merely 12 cycles of 30 days. From this observation, they would derive their lunar year, which approximated the truth far more closely than their solar calculation. Thus, they established a system of 13 months, each consisting of 4 weeks. They would also promptly discover that the planetary bodies numbered 7, assigning 1 to each day of the week, a practice recognized as having been universal, extending from the east to the west across the globe. A protracted span of years likely elapsed subsequent to this era before they discovered the great zodiacal or precessional year of 23,920 years. In analogy to the preceding division, and for other analogical reasons connected with the aforementioned solar and lunar years, they divided this figure by 60, thereby obtaining the number 432, which serves as the foundation of the great Indian cycles. Upon arriving at this deduction, They must have possessed extreme erudition and likely rectified their earlier errors, inventing the celebrated cycles known as the Neros, the Savos, the Erins, etc. It is unnecessary to pursue this train of reasoning further at the present juncture. However, we shall resume this inquiry in due course. In an inquiry regarding whether an ancient nation possessed knowledge of letters and arithmetic at a specific epoch, it appears natural, primarily, to consult the works of contemporary or ancient authors. Herein we shall uncover evidence of the most satisfactory nature, which will, I apprehend, terminate all disputes concerning this question as applied to the ancient inhabitants of Gaul and Britain. Caesar stands, I believe, as a witness in this case as unexceptionable as it is possible in the nature of things for a witness to be. He states, speaking of the Druids, the priests of these peoples, that they did not deem it lawful to commit the secrets of their religion to writing, although in the public and common affairs of life they employed Greek letters. He notes, nor do they consider it right to commit these things to writing, although in almost all other public and private matters they use Greek letters. I know not how evidence regarding a dry matter of fact could arguably be clearer than this. It is evident that Caesar possessed no ulterior motive in stating this fact. It falls from his pen in the course of his narrative in the most unquestionable manner imaginable. In certain of his observations, we shall find cause to make allowance for individual or national vanity, animosity toward his enemies, or a desire to disguise or palliate his own cruelty and injustice. Yet nothing of that nature is requisite here. In his commentaries, Caesar relates that he dispatched a letter to Quintus Cicero, in a distant region of Gaul, written in the Greek language, in order that if it were intercepted by the Gauls, they might not comprehend it. Now, this can in no other way be rendered consistent with the quotation I have just provided than by translating, as I have done, using the word language and not letters. Then the case would be precisely analogous to that of a French general waging war in England, and dispatching home an account written in English letters, or the characters common to both nations, but composed in the French language. The Gauls and the Greeks utilized the same or nearly the same characters, yet the languages were totally dissimilar. However, there exist other passages and circumstances which tend to demonstrate that the Druids employed Greek letters. Caesar states that tablets were discovered in the encampment of the Helvetii, inscribed in Greek characters, which contained a detailed census of the Helvetian nation. Now, it is indeed true that the word literus may here signify the language. Nevertheless, when the definition of the word literus in other contexts and all attendant circumstances are considered, it is far more probable that it denotes letters and not language. If it signified letters only, it remains consistent with Caesar's dispatching of a missive in those characters to Cicero. If it signifies language, the act of Caesar is directly contrary to common sense. The conclusion of Mr. Huddleston is entirely correct. At any rate, this passage constitutes clear proof that the Celts possessed the ability to read, write, and calculate, for these registers extend as high as 368,000. If Pinkerton will not concede to the Celts an alphabet of their own, he cannot, at the very least, deny that 1850 years ago, they utilized the Greek one. In the former quotation, Caesar remarks, "Nor do they consider it right to commit these things to writing." Mr. Huddleston's conclusion, derived from these words of Caesar, is equally sound, namely, that they demonstrate the familiarity of letters, for there can be no prohibition against a thing unknown. Strabo and Caesar both assert that the latter conversed with Diviciacus by means of an interpreter. This is perfectly consistent with the preceding articulation and lends its support. Regarding the Gauls, Caesar observes that they all possessed the same language, notwithstanding minor dialectal variations. However, he notes that it was customary for them to traverse to Britain to improve themselves in the discipline of the Druids, a circumstance which virtually demonstrates that the two countries shared the same language. Furthermore, Tacitus expressly states that the languages of Gaul and Britain did not significantly differ. Mr. Huddleston has judiciously observed that the Tertitani, the most ancient inhabitants of Spain, were Celts, and Strabo informs us that they possessed laws written in verse 1,000 years prior to his time. Tacitus records the existence of certain monuments and sepulchres bearing Greek inscriptions remaining on the confines of Germany and Rhaetia. If such inscriptions indeed existed, they might readily be in the Greek of Cadmus, the ancient Phoenician, which may have been legible, albeit with difficulty, in his time. Although the Phoenician and Greek alphabetic systems were essentially identical, it is known that, in the space of 300 or 400 years, their forms underwent substantial alteration. Commenting upon this passage of Caesar, Ledwich remarks, "The voice of antiquity is silent as to Druidic letters, which are said to have been used in this isle. Caesar says they existed, but that passage has been long suspected as the interpolation of Julius Celsus, who I believe had Strabo in view when he inserted it. It is true that in the passage of Caesar which I have quoted, he does not explicitly state that letters were used by the Druids in Britain. However, one can hardly entertain a doubt that they were utilized in Britain if they were in use in Gaul. As Caesar attests, both countries had been, only a short time previously, under the dominion of the same monarch, Caesar's friend and ally Diviciacus, who was a chief Druid as well as a sovereign, and, in this respect, constitutes an exact model of Melchizedek. Cannot be gainsaid that Ledwich's inference is both precipitous and inequitable. If Caesar's assertion proves accurate, that the Gauls were accustomed to dispatching their youth to the British Druids for tutelage, and that the employment of letters was established in Gaul, it would be supremely preposterous to postulate that the use of letters was unknown in Britain. For a prolonged period, I remained in a state of astonishment regarding the irascibility exhibited by sundry authors when treating of the erudition of the ancient Druids. I am ultimately persuaded that the origin of this sentiment may be discovered in a passage of Origen against Celsus. Mr. Ledwich remarks that it is above 1500 years since Celsus contrasted the antiquity and wisdom of the Druids with that of the Jews. What, then, was Origen's rejoinder? I am unaware, states the Church Father, that they have bequeathed to us any written records. It was incumbent upon Celsus then, as it is upon our Druidic proponents now, to substantiate the extraordinary claims they have propounded regarding these sages with arguments extending beyond mere confident asseverations. The argument of Ledwich against Celsus will doubtless appear satisfactory to the generality of readers, and in all probability, it appeared so to the author himself. Yet, perhaps, it may prove no arduous task to provide a refutation. The reason Celsus never substantiated the extraordinary assertion he made respecting Druidic learning in response to Origen is simply this, that he had been interred in his grave for 50 years prior to Origen writing against him, a fact which various passages in Origen's work demonstrate he comprehended perfectly well. Celsus had expatiated upon the excellent doctrines as well as the antiquity of the Druids, and, as Origen was fully aware that Celsus could not respond, he ought to have offered his readership something more substantial than a bare assertion, bolstered only by the admission of his own ignorance, to refute his opponent. The actual state of the case appears to be as follows. Celsus's arguments could not be satisfactorily answered by Origen, or at least were not deemed so, and the ignorant priesthood, ever frightened without cause, becoming alarmed lest Celsus be perceived as having the superior argument, fabricated the narrative of the interpolation to aid their ally Origen. There exists, I believe, no variation in manuscripts nor any other cause to warrant the notion that the word Greasus is an interpolation. Had there been any dubiety upon this point, is it credible that Origen would have remained ignorant of it? And had he possessed such knowledge, would he not have instantly remarked upon it? It would have constituted his most effective rejoinder to Celsus, provided he knew anything of the passage in Caesar. However, there is no ground to suppose that the passage in Caesar was ever, in any manner, brought into question between the disputants. It does not appear to have been cited by either Celsus or Origen. Yet, merely because it appears to militate against their system, our clergy have deemed it proper to dismiss it as an interpolation. A few years subsequently, as soon as the Christian religion achieved dominance, the works of Celsus were prohibited under penalty of death, and, in consequence, have all long since been obliterated. It is a fact of no small import which we derive from this passage of Origen against Celsus, that the Druids were not only well known to the Roman philosophers, but were held up by them as paragons of wisdom and models for imitation on account of some preeminent merit. Furthermore, the response of Origen, by its guarded manner, seems to afford reasonable grounds for the suspicion that he was aware that, in their own far distant lands, the Druids possessed writings. It is not unjust to suspect this of the man who actually embodied fraud into a system, practiced it with the approbation of his peers, and assigned it the technical appellation of economia, by which it has been known ever since. It is curious to observe Ledwich's management of this passage from Caesar, which instantly condemns his entire theory regarding the ignorance of the Druids. He states that he harbors a suspicion, then instantly, with no rationale other than his own surmise, settles the matter as an incontrovertible, established fact, and draws conclusions accordingly. The sole reason that can be adduced by those who contend that the word Greasus is an interpolation is that the word appears in the text within brackets. They pretend only to suspect the single word between the brackets, yet Ledwich at once discards the entire passage. The word literus, which Caesar employs in the other passage regarding the returns of the Celtic army, raises a strong presumption that he intended precisely what the words strictly imply. How monstrous is the supposition that Celsus should have flattered himself that, by the corruption of one or two copies of Caesar, he might succeed in corrupting all copies throughout the Roman Empire. It is highly probable that every manuscript of Caesar now extant has been transcribed by a Christian priest, and I believe no unprejudiced individual who has studied the history of the monastic ages will hesitate to agree with me that it is far more likely that some monk in an early period, when perhaps very few manuscripts existed, inserted the brackets, than that Celsus succeeded in interpolating the word. But, whether the word Greasus be an interpolation or otherwise, the passage from Caesar demonstrates that the Celts possessed letters, and the account of the dispatch sent to Cicero proves that Caesar did not write unadvisedly, but with deliberation and forethought, the result of inquiry. If the word Greasus be omitted, then the passage proves they possessed letters, and if it be retained, it indicates Greek letters, which must originally have been identical to the Greek letters brought by Cadmus to Greece prior to their augmentation, or that alphabet termed the Pelasgic. However, there exists another potent expression of Caesar's which has been highlighted by Mr. Huddleston. Caesar, assigning the cause for why the Druids did not commit their doctrines to writing, states, "They appear to me to have enacted this law for two reasons, because they neither wished their doctrines to be divulged to the vulgar, nor desired their pupils, trusting to the aid of letters, to pay less attention to the cultivation of the memory. Surely this passage is, of itself, sufficient to demonstrate that letters were common in Gaul in Caesar's estimation. The objective of Ledwich is, once he has dispensed with the word Greasus, to maintain that the Druids possessed no letters, because he imagines his adversaries cannot demonstrate the nature of those characters. But this argument the other circumstances of the returns, etc., would overthrow. I therefore conclude that the three expressions of Caesar constitute unquestionable, incontrovertible evidence, notwithstanding all that has been insinuated against them. Amongst the ancient Greeks and certain neighboring nations, two very archaic alphabets appear to have been known. One of these was designated the Pelasgic, the Attic, the Argive, or the Arcadian alphabet. It was probably identical to the Etruscan, or Old Italian alphabet, which was also termed Arcadian, because it was reputedly transported out of Arcadia into Latium by Evander. Very little is ascertained respecting these Pelasgi. Their name has been observed to bear a striking resemblance to the Hebrew Pulgim. Be that as it may, they appear to have introduced their letters with them into Europe. For Eustathius, a writer of reputable credit, in his commentary on the Second Iliad, assigns it as one reason why the Pelasgi were styled divine, that they alone, of all the Greeks, preserved the use of letters subsequent to the deluge. The other alphabet is denominated the Ionian, Phoenician, Cadmean, or Aeolian. The Greeks ascribed to the conductor of this colony the name of Cadmus, and to the people the name of Phoenicians. The term Cadmus is of Hebrew origin, signifying an oriental personage. One of the nations of the Canaanites conquered by Joshua is designated by this appellation. These two alphabets appear to have been radically identical and to have possessed the same number of letters. Mr. Davies observes that they do not appear to have augmented the number of the letters. Only 16 are ascribed to Cadmus. An identical number is claimed by the ancient Latins, the ancient Germans, the Irish, and the British bards. The Welsh letters are now 36 in number. However, the late Dr. Richards, in his concise treatise edited by Dr. Evans, maintains that merely 16 of them are radical, and that they are almost entirely identical to the Etruscan. It must be admitted, I believe, that all those European tongues possessing 16 letters, irrespective of their provenance, shared but a single common origin. Diodorus Siculus informs us that Cadmus did not originally invent the letters, but merely altered their figures. Diodorus is a highly reputable historian, and from this account, it may be inferred that the Greeks possessed the ability to read and write prior to the arrival of this Cadmus, or this Oriental importation, among them. Tacitus states that Cecrops introduced an alphabet to the Athenians. These characters must have been more ancient than those of Cadmus, and this alphabet contained the old Attic characters, the archaic letters of the Greeks. It was in these characters that the inscription of Megara was composed, the most ancient stone monument Pausanias had beheld in Greece, discovered in the tomb of Charybdis, which was erected shortly after the demise of Cecrops. Thus, we may regard as established the well-known historical fact that the common Greek letters currently in use originated in the East, that initially they did not exceed 17 in number, that approximately at the time of the Trojan War, for new letters were added to them by Palamedes, and subsequently for more by Simonides. It may be observed from Table 2 that the quantity of letters in the ancient Celtic Irish alphabet did not exceed 17, and of those, 16 were the identical characters reputed to have been transported from Phoenicia by Cadmus. Even a cursory examination of the table must convince any observer that the letter systems of the Samaritans, the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Irish Celts must originally have been identical. It is entirely impossible that their extraordinary and close coincidence could have been the result of mere accident. Mr. Huddleston has justly observed that this coincidence must have stemmed from the original and absolute identity of the alphabets themselves. He inquires, if the Irish had culled or selected their alphabet from that of the Romans, as some individuals have absurdly imagined, how or by what miracle could they have settled upon the identical letters Cadmus brought from Phoenicia while rejecting all the others? Had they cast 16 dice 16 times and turned up the same number on every occasion, it would not have been as marvelous as this. The identity of the Cadmean and Irish alphabets is not, therefore, the effect of chance or happenstance. Dr. Parsons states, "It appears that the Irish amanuenses transcribed the Latin Gospels in their own characters, of which I have seen several copies, finely executed. However, they were obliged, when writing the Latin language, to incorporate the secondary letters, for which their own 17 were insufficient, and which that language could not forego. Furthermore, it is highly remarkable that in all the manuscripts of their own tongue, not a single additional letter beyond the primary 17 can be identified. Yet, I discover that in certain printed books in that language, such as Bishop Bedell's Irish Bible and New Testament, the aspirate H is included. This has caused some modern grammarians to calculate 18 letters in the Irish alphabet. Now, this evidence provided by Dr. Parsons is quite conclusive regarding the antiquity of this alphabet, for no one can believe that the Irish would have failed to adopt the entire alphabet had they been copying from modern Greek, Latin, or Hebrew. It appears to me to confirm the antiquity of the manuscripts in which this limited number is employed. It tends to corroborate the authenticity of the manuscripts, and the manuscripts, in turn, tend to corroborate the antiquity of the alphabet. A single glance at the Ogham is sufficient, given their distinct style, to convince any person which are the new and which are the old letters. Dr. Smith observes that the Greek I expresses a sound so common in the Gaelic, and so imperfectly articulated by the combined powers of C, or K, and H, that the Irish could not possibly have omitted it had it been present in the alphabet when they adopted the remainder of their letters. So far would they have been from excluding it, that it is rather a wonder they never conceived of inventing such a letter to avoid the necessity of making perpetual substitutions for it. If the Ogham Bethluisnian had been a modern fabrication, the definitions of several letter names, Peathbog, Sewell, and Tain, for instance, would have been provided, rather than ignorance of their meaning being confessed. Individuals fabricating the former would scarcely have left the latter void. In the act of devising the one, they would inevitably have contrived the other. Mr. Vallancey has remarked that the profane script of the Irish Druids, known as the Babeloth, bears a striking resemblance to the Punic or Phoenician. Moreover, appended to the conclusion of his grammar within the 8th table, one discovers an alphabet derived from ancient Samaritan coinage that is virtually identical in character configuration, or as nearly so as possible, to one of the Irish alphabets. The reader has doubtless perceived a minor discrepancy within this line of reasoning concerning the variation between 16 and 17 letters. Nevertheless, this slight anomaly is by no means sufficient to invalidate the general conclusion. This variance arises from the digamma, a subject still attended by considerable difficulties, notwithstanding the extensive erudition and labor bestowed upon it by Bentley, Marsh, and numerous other learned authorities. Yet, in truth, since the existence of the digamma in the ancient Greek alphabet is now acknowledged, no genuine discrepancy subsists. It is worthy of note that this very circumstance tends strongly to confirm the antiquity of the Irish alphabets, for had they been of recent adoption, yet prior to Mr. Payne Knight's demonstration that the digamma constituted an integral component of the Greek alphabet, only 16 letters would have been manifest. The presence of 17 characters, one being the digamma, in these ancient alphabets, which are evidently identical to the Greek, serves strongly to corroborate Mr. Knight's argument respecting the antiquity of the digamma. Thus, in a curious manner, they reciprocally confirm one another. It is now manifest that, had the Greek tongue not surrendered its digamma, it would have possessed precisely the 17 letters found in the Irish. Dr. Shuckford has observed that the ancient Hebrews shared the same tongue and characters with the Canaanites or Phoenicians, a fact evidenced by the concurrent testimonies of numerous authors. Indeed, all the nations of those regions, the Phoenicians, Canaanites, Samaritans, and likely the Assyrians, spoke and wrote in a cognate manner for a considerable period. Upon further examination of the table, it becomes apparent that our modern English alphabet is identical to those previously considered, excepting only such variations as might be anticipated from the lapse of ages. The letter G appears to constitute the sole material deviation. It may be safely assumed that none will deny the identity of the English with the Greek alphabets. This premise being granted, its identity with the Hebrew and Samaritan must likewise be conceded. The fact that the Samaritan, Greek, and Hebrew letters all possess the same powers of notation serves as a curious and infallible proof of their identity. Regarding the Arabic language, we shall find perhaps more than a mere suspicion that it is the elder of the two. This, I ascertain, constitutes the surmise of Sir William Jones, leading to the conjecture that all Hebrew verbal roots are to be discovered within the Arabic tongue. The Arabic alphabet currently comprises 28 characters. However, the Bishop of St. David's, in his Arabic grammar, asserts that 17 of these are fundamental figures, possessing notational powers identical to those of the Hebrew letters in their established sequence, such as Aleph 1, Beth 2, Gimel 3, etc., thereby establishing their original identity beyond dispute. The Persian alphabet bears so profound a resemblance to the Arabic that, should the reader affix 3 diacritical points to the base of the second and third letters, and to the summit of the 5th and 11th, one would effectively possess both the Arabic and Persian syllabaries. According to Dr. Burgess, the 17 primary characters of the Arabic alphabet appear to be the precise equivalents of the ancient Irish letters. In Table 1, the reader has observed an exemplar of the Ogham scripts, specifically the Beth Louisnayan Ogham of the ancient Irish Druids, employed to record those arcane doctrines they deemed appropriate to commit to written form. Utilizing these characters, a renowned epigraph known as the Callan inscription was discovered in Ireland some years past. A plate illustrating this artifact is presented in the Archaeology of the Society of Antiquaries of London, and may be viewed at the foot of the second plate of languages. Dr. Aiken observes that 15 lines are requisite to articulate merely the first 5 letters of this alphabet, and that such lines are susceptible to translation in 5 distinct manners. Consequently, nothing could be more ambiguous than its true signification, nor could anything have been more ingeniously devised to conceal the purport of its contents from the vulgar eye. Furthermore, it is probable that, akin to the modern cells of the Inquisition beneath the Carthusian convent at Baden, this system was designed to sequester the secrets of the priesthood from kings and potentates, no less than from the common populace. It might have been fashioned to encapsulate 2 distinct narratives, one for the sacerdotal class and another for the monarchs, should the latter have insisted upon instruction beyond what the priests deemed prudent to divulge. It is indubitable that the Oghams are the result of regular, preconcerted design and systematic invention, rather than the product of accident or circumstance. In this regard, they are analogous to Sanskrit. The converse holds true for all other alphabets, which are the progeny of circumstance and have assumed their present configurations through gradual evolution. These agams were manifestly engineered for secrecy. Naturally, it would invite ridicule were one to advance the proposition that these rudimentary alphabets existed and were utilized, even by the nations of Syria, prior to the emergence of the extant Samaritan or Hebrew characters. The primary objection to this hypothesis concerns the immensity of time requisite. Yet let any individual estimate how many millennia the caves of Ellora or the pillars of Stonehenge have endured, or may yet endure, and the author shall subsequently specify the epoch before which a system so elemental in form could not have existed. There exists a narrative recounted by Lucian, and cited by Mr. Toland, which is particularly intriguing. He relates that, in Gaul, he observed Hercules depicted as a diminutive elder, whom the local vernacular termed Ogmius, drawing after him an infinite multitude of individuals who appeared exceedingly willing to follow, despite being drawn by extremely delicate and almost imperceptible chains. These were fastened at one end to their ears and secured at the other, not in Hercules's hands, which were otherwise engaged, but to the tip of his tongue, wherein a perforation existed specifically to serve as the convergence point for these bonds. Lucian, marveling at this mode of portraying Hercules, was informed by a learned Druid standing nearby that Hercules did not, in Gaul as in Greece, signify physical prowess, but rather the force of eloquence, a concept beautifully elucidated by the Druid in his exegesis of the image suspended within the temple. The expression employed by Lucian is, they call Hermes in the Celtic tongue Ogmios, reflecting the local pronunciation. Herein, Lucian unequivocally asserts that Ogmius was a Gallic word, a term of the country Epicurean. It is indeed unadulterated Celtic, signifying, to employ the phrase of Tacitus regarding the Germans, the secret of letters, particularly the characters themselves, and consequently the scholarship dependent upon them, from which the force of eloquence proceeds. Thus, Hercules Ogmius represents the learned Hercules, or Hercules the protector of learning, having been reputed by many to be a philosopher himself. To substantiate this interpretation of the term, an account both natural and apt, one must comprehend that from the very inception of the colony, Ogam, variously transcribed as Ogam or Ogma, has signified in Ireland the secret of letters or the Irish alphabet. For the veracity of this assertion, I invoke the authority of the entire corpus of Irish manuscripts without a solitary exception. It stands as one of the most authentic terms in the language, having originally designated this concept exclusively. Surely, following this exposition, the origin of Hercules Ogmius can no longer remain a matter of doubt. Mr. Toland proceeds to observe, with respect to these letters, that following the Christian introduction of the Roman script, the native characters soon fell into desuetude, becoming intelligible solely to antiquaries. From this circumstance, it transpired that Ogam, having once signified the secret of writing, came to denote secret writing itself, though still principally implying the original Irish characters. On this particular point, I diverge from Mr. Toland. I posit that one of the Ogams constituted the original, secret, and sacred script of the Druids, and that the script which Caesar identified as Greek was the common character, either the Cadmean or the Ionian 17 letters prior to the loss of the digamma, both being, in fact, nearly identical, having been derived from a common source. Subsequent to the introduction of Christianity, the Ogam writings, being unintelligible to the priesthood, were presumed to be magical and were obliterated wherever discovered. Patrick is reputed to have consigned 300 volumes inscribed with these characters to the flames. Even if Patrick never existed, there can be no doubt that those who ascribe this act to him as a merit would have executed the destruction in his name. The term Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.